about tonight or the next hour is how stuff gets in from the outside into your lungs. Get my stick here. So obviously air comes in here, it goes down the trachea into the lungs. By the way, the mannequins over there have some nice models on them for the lobes, the lungs and stuff. We'll talk about that. So we're going to talk about the nose, the pharynx, the trachea, and the lungs, and along the way how all this stuff works. It's real simple though. You won't have trouble. All right, so the respiratory system is divided into two parts, and roughly here I'll use this chart to do it. The upper and the lower respiratory systems, and the reason we divide it like this is because each system has its own sort of unique structures, features, and medical conditions which are found in both of these systems. So the upper respiratory system on this chart, it says it's the nose, the nasal cavity, and the pharynx, and the lower is the larynx, trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. Well, so what we're talking about is roughly from the stick on up, this area, because right here's the larynx, the voice box. So sort of right here on up would be the upper respiratory system, and then the lower respiratory system would be all the way down and including the lungs. The upper respiratory system, nose, nasal cavity, pharynx, lower larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So we're going to talk about the upper respiratory system first, and then the lower respiratory system. One of the things that you do need to know, though, is also the respiratory system is divided into two general parts referred to as sort of the conduction zone and the actual respiratory zone. So really, almost everything we talk about is just getting air into the lungs, down to the respiratory zone. So all of this, until we get into the lungs, would also be just part of the conduction zone. So, nasal cavity to the smallest bronchioles in the lungs, that's just getting air into the lungs. And then we get down into the very small exchange sacs, which is that model on that back counter I said I don't use we get into the little exchange sacs, which are called alveoli. And this is where gas exchange takes place. Oxygen and CO2 take place in these millions and millions and millions of tiny little sacs in the lungs, where you'll see in a little while a gas can diffuse across a very thin membrane. So getting it into the sort of smallest portions, smaller portions of the lung, and then this is where we actually get the exchange of gases. So we go conducting into respiratory. 4 phases. The first phase is called pulmonary ventilation, and this is just air in and out of the lungs. It's just breathing. All right, so that's the first phase, just moving air in and out. And then external respiration is in the lungs. That's the gas exchange, O2, CO2. Right? Oxygen diffuses in and CO2 diffuses out. Then we get the cardiovascular system involved. And this is transport of the respiratory gases from the lungs to the tissues in the red blood cells. And then finally, in the capillary beds in our tissues, we have internal respiration, which is the exchange of gases. Oxygen diffusing in, CO2 diffusing out, and that completes the cycle. And then it just repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. Obviously, you guys know that in a hospital environment, as nurses, you interact often with all kinds of medical specialists, and one of the specialties that you'll see in the hospitals, of course, are the respiratory people, the respiratory technicians, and others who deal with issues dealing with respiration, and people have trouble breathing and that sort of stuff. So these are the phases: moving it in, exchange in the lungs, transport in the blood, and then exchange of gases in our tissue beds. So those are easy to remember, 4 phases. All right, now the parts. The only visible part of the respiratory system you actually see is your nose. Just a little bit of that, of course. It's, we breathe through our nose. We also breathe through our mouth sometimes. I know that, right? But breathe through your nose. And when you breathe through your nose, the function of the nose, of course, is to moisten and warm the air. We don't really worry about that so much around here. Also, the fine little hairs and things like that in our nose also filter the air. Remember, hasn't been that many years ago. We had the terrible fires, and you remember how dirty the air was when you blew your nose. You're going, oh my goodness, all this stuff is, so that was in the air. Also, the nose is a resonating chamber of speech. Smell receptors, also in the nose. And the epithelial lining. Uh-oh, not epithelial tissue again. Yeah, sorry. The epithelial lining is the stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. We find this epithelial lining quite frequently in the respiratory system. So the only visible part, right there. Move air in, moistens, warms the air. Of course, I have one other thing. It's on here. I forgot. Of course, the concha bones, the inferior, middle, and nasal concha, which you actually see on this chart right here, I guess. So this would be inferior, middle, and superior nasal concha bones, or as is also they're called the turbinate bones, because the air scrolls around on these sort of projections in your nose and helps, again, moisten and warm the air and stuff like that. For those of you who have never lived in a really cold climate, which some of us have, breathing in through your nose in the wintertime can be a really interesting experience. When it's really cold, it almost feels like your nose is freezing because the air is so cold. So you don't have to worry about that out here. So that's the visible part. Now, the throat, the pharynx, is divided into three parts. And this chart right here is a useful model to roughly divide the pharynx into its three parts.